Welcome back. We're glad to have you on episode 2 of An Offer You Can't Refuse, The History of Organized Crime in the United States. I'm your host, Ryan S. Pettengill. And today we're going to continue our conversation on starting points in the history of organized crime. Because like I mentioned in episode 1, starting points are really, really important. Today's example, at least from the perspective of an individual, is probably going to strike you as a more likely person to be discussed in the context of organized crime, but the setting is going to be probably something that you might not have settled on before you started listening to our podcast. We're also going to kind of discuss the intersection of law enforcement and organized crime. It's certainly going to play a big role in today's episode, but before we do that, we need to discuss the setting. Similar to New York and Frederica Mandelbaum, it's impossible to understand the world of David Hennessey without first having a conversation on New Orleans, Louisiana. La Nouvelle-Orléans was a center that the French had established in 1718. It was a colonial center in French Louisiana, basically to conduct trade. There was all kinds of peoples, in some cases indigenous peoples, in other cases other European groups that the French wanted to do business with. And the fact that the city that we now call New Orleans was located right there on the Caribbean Sea put it in a prime location to do business. And so it's really not that difficult to see or understand why the French would really establish the city of New Orleans as a center of trade, pretty similar to what the Dutch were doing in New Amsterdam, what probably seemed like a world away. In any case, although it was a center of trade, it's going to quickly develop a reputation for illicit activities as well. As a matter of fact, from the beginning, the city's institutions seemed to be founded on this intrepid morality. And New Orleans itself would really buttress the careers of pirates, slippery politicians, madams, gangsters, shady entrepreneurs, and for our purposes here today, ambitious policemen that weren't exactly making enough money from their salaries that they were drawing from the city, and maybe we're looking to make up a little bit of that on the side. More of that in just a second. But you have to understand that this context, similar to what we saw with Frederica Mandelbaum and New York, this context is very much influenced by the process of Gilded Age immigration. With respect to Mandelbaum, we really focused on the Germans and German immigration to the United States throughout the 19th century. And we touched upon the Irish a little bit. We need to come back and bring the Irish into focus better and more thoroughly for our story here in New Orleans to make some sense. Irish immigration, and when I say immigration, I mean to the United States very, very generally, very, very broadly. As I pointed out in the last episode, it's a product of English imperialism. It's a product of, I don't know that I go so far as to say manufactured poverty, but certainly poverty. I made mention of the fact that in certain instances by the 1840s, the Irish were subsisting on 90% of their diet based on the potato, right? And when that crop began to fail in the 1840s, there was widespread hunger and in much of the country, starvation. And so the Irish are more or less going to be pushed out of their homeland, and because the United States economy was booming, they're going to be drawn into America because there's opportunity over here. When they were forced to flee, the Irish are going to actually offer up yet another commodity, And that commodity, of course, is going to be their labor, the work that they will be conducting while they're over here, kind of laying a foundation for what's going to become the largest and most robust economy anywhere in the world. Whether that is laying a railroad infrastructure every which way across the North American continent, or, like we found out the last time, if it's digging a gigantic ditch that attaches one end of New York with the other end of New York. And of course, I'm talking about the Erie Canal. So I'm hopeful that you're able to see how central Irish labor was to the American economy. And as you're about to find out, it's going to be Irish labor that really is going to play a very pivotal role in New Orleans. The Irish were, in several different ways, unlikely newcomers. And because they were steeped in the experience of English imperialism, which, as I mentioned the last time, the whole point of imperialism was to extract the wealth from one country and funnel it into the other, of course they're going to develop a sense of resistance. It's only human nature that they would. And in many instances, this resistance is going to take the form of anti-colonial resistance movements. And in some cases, what that's going to do is it's going to evolve into secret societies. These societies are going to exist underground. They're going to be very, very clannish, or at least they're going to give the appearance of very clannish. In some instances, this is going to be grounded in violence, in others, sabotage. But nonetheless, it's going to embed itself deeply, deeply into the Irish identity. But this experience led to the earliest inclinings of what I'll call gangsterism. There's going to be several groups that emerge that you and I would refer to as gangs, or at least criminal organizations, but the Irish don't see them as such. Groups like the White Boys or the Ribbon Men, we would call those gangs, but the Irish would probably, at least insofar as the time period is concerned, refer to them as forms of resistance. One more quick example. More labor history coming at you. The Molly Maguires, make no mistake about it, you and I would refer to this group as a terrorist organization, because what this group of Irish and Irish-American coal miners were doing in places like Pennsylvania is blowing up buildings or setting buildings on fire. These were company buildings, right? And the Irish, in large part, were workers, and the Molly Maguires, as the Irish saw it, were standing up to employer exploitation. In other instances, they would kidnap their employers, their bosses, and ransom them back to the company. And so, in no other world would we call them anything other than a terrorist organization. But given the Irish experience with English colonization and imperialism, trying to extract the wealth out of them and funnel it back into the mother country, this was a way to stand up to that. And so you have to understand that the Molly Maguires don't really present themselves as a terrorist organization. They more or less present themselves as custodians of their communities, caretakers of their communities. But here's the problem with that. The problem with organizations like the Molly Maguires and the kinds of identities that they would eventually assume is that it really played into the hands of those anti-Irish stereotypes that we were talking about the other episode. The idea that the English referred to the Irish as an inferior race, a group of people who were so intellectually inferior to them, the English, that they'd never be able to wrap their brains around complex systems like a democratic republic or capitalism or things of that variety. Of course, it was pure and simple racism, or at best, ethnic bigotry, but nonetheless, existing in organizations that were, engaged in terrorism, and came across as very, very clannish, was not really doing the Irish a whole lot of favors with respect to their image and their identity here in the United States. Now, thus far, I've been articulating the process of Irish immigration, and I've been doing it in a very generic, very general way. When I'm talking about Irish immigration, I'm talking to all of your hotspot destinations. Of course, New York. Boston also makes a very good case. Philadelphia makes another good case. The Irish are not typically described in the processes of immigrants who are going to land in New Orleans. But in fact, the Irish are really going to be a group that begins showing up in droves, especially in those middle decades of the 19th century. The question becomes why? Because although New Orleans was a center of trade, it certainly wasn't the industrial manufacturing powerhouse that Boston was, let alone a place like New York or Philadelphia. The fact was, many Irish immigrants who eventually found their way to New Orleans were essentially tricked into going there. Labor agents, recruiters that were trying to bring them into the city as a source of cheap labor, proclaimed that New Orleans was only a few days' journey from New York or Boston. When you're Irish and you don't really have a real good understanding of the North American continent, this probably makes a little bit of sense. And because you don't have any idea of exactly what you're getting into, you're more inclined to be tricked into arriving into this place, and it worked. Now, why did Louisiana landowners, Louisiana business owners want the Irish to come and settle in their neck of the woods? Well, for the same reason that Alexander Hamilton wanted to go to Europe in the first place and recruit an army of workers. The fact was they were cheap labor, and Louisiana cotton merchants actively recruited famine refugees in English centers like Liverpool. They were a cheap source of labor, and if you could bring them over, this was going to be one more way to drive down the cost of doing business. Now, think about Louisiana, very generally speaking, New Orleans or anywhere really. Much of it anyway, is a gigantic swamp. And if you're going to take a stab at plantation agriculture, whether this is cotton in the 19th century or sugar in the 18th and 19th century, both of those commodities are cash crops, and you're going to make an awful lot of money if you grow them, but they're also very labor intensive, okay? Now, for those of you that have studied American history, you know that by the time that the United States adds what is now the modern-day state of Louisiana, slavery is alive and well in the Republic. It was squeaky clean legal, and in a lot of ways it was protected by the Constitution. And Louisiana was not only a slave state, it was a state that depended, whose economy was in a lot of ways organized around slavery. But keep in mind, slaves were a major investment. And it was an investment that you didn't want to necessarily throw into a precarious situation. Now, I realize that I'm getting into some gray areas here, and I want to remove the morality from slavery for just a second. I'm not trying to say that one group had it better than another. That's certainly not my point right here. What I'm trying to get at is that when it came to draining swamps, a lot of slave owners were not willing to take a chance at essentially killing their slaves. You could make a lot of money in New Orleans and Louisiana, generally speaking, but it wasn't enough money to really offset the loss of a slave's life. Every time you lost that slave, you had to replace her or him, and that was a lot of money, and not just anybody could afford to just have that kind of turnover in their slave population. So when it comes to draining swamps, a very dangerous and labor-intensive job, a lot of Louisianans preferred to employ Irish laborers as opposed to putting their slaves out there to drain the swamps. Fever was a disease that was directly associated with swamp draining, and it wreaked havoc on the worker populations that were forced to go out there and drain those swamps to make room for plantation agriculture. So the Irish are used in many of these instances to do the heavy lifting of draining these swamps, because you can pay them an incredibly low wage per day, and it doesn't really matter if they croak. If they do die, be it from yellow fever or something else, it's not really going to make all that much of a difference, because as the way that these Louisiana landowners saw it, you could always just go recruit somebody else. It wasn't as devastating. It wasn't devastating at all, really, if you drain the morality from all of this, as losing one of your slaves, because you weren't as deep into that investment. So let's talk about the Irish experience in New Orleans. In our last episode, we were talking about the Gilded Age, and I had noted that it's called that primarily because of its shallow values. You have these business magnates, people like Andrew Carnegie in steel and John D. Rockefeller in oil. These are individuals that were brilliant businessmen in their own right, but they very clearly prioritize profit and the corporation far, far more than they did people and their human capital. So the Gilded Age was a very, very difficult time to be a worker, because there's virtually no regulation. There's no law implemented, backed up by the government, that says you got to give your workforce a break every so many hours, or you need to pay them at least this much. There's no such thing as a minimum wage. And really, that's not going to change for the next several decades. There's another side to this as well, and that side exists in the working class communities. Because in addition to taking the most difficult, most dangerous jobs, workers lived in the most dangerous communities. Dangerous in the sense that there was virtually no public health standards, at least none that we would recognize, and dangerous in the sense that they were crime and vice infested. They were dangerous places to exist. New Orleans was no different. It was no different in the sense that workers were thrown into these dangerous, life-threatening jobs, and they existed in some of the most dangerous communities. The Irish community was largely concentrated into the most undesirable section of the city that most New Orleans residents referred to as the third municipality. And just the deplorable conditions of this area was not lost on the powers that be. The city's newspaper, the Times-Picayune, described the community, and I'm quoting them here, quote, "A small house in Dauphine Street contains about 50 immigrants, worn down by starvation and disease to mere skeletons, some of them eating straw that they had gathered in the street." End quote. There's no law that says that you can't pack 50 people into one apartment. There's no law that says that you need to provide good ventilation or a window or a fire escape. And so you can see how it would be so dangerous to live in such circumstances. And I'm also hopeful that you can see, very similar to Frederica Mandelbaum in New York, that the city's underworld naturally grew out of these conditions. You've got human suffering, and when people come along and say, I can ease that suffering, but you need to bend the law just a little bit, naturally you've got a captive audience. So let's talk about early Irish gangs in New Orleans. And I want to introduce you to two of them, and it's not so that you've got some trivia the next time that you happen to be out. You're going to see how these groups contribute to our story here in a second. The first group is a group calling themselves the Corkians. And the Corkians are going to get their start as an anti-British society. Keep in mind, the Irish experience with British colonization made British hating to be one of the most favorable Irish pastimes in this period. But over the course of time, some of these Corkians, especially people that are going to rise to leadership ranks in the group, are going to understand that there's a dollar to be made here in the city. And that dollar is supplying Irish labor workers to local businessmen who are looking to do things on the cheap. If you can supply a commodity, and better yet, a commodity that's cheap and desirable, like low-wage workers, then that's really going to put a good opportunity in front of you to cash in. And the Corkians, at least their leaders, understand that. The problem: you've got another rival group calling themselves the United Irishmen. And very similar to the Corkians, they get their start in anti-British sentiment, and over the course of time, they're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to supply local businessmen with cheap workers. And in 1834, all of this is going to boil over. It's going to come to a head in a gang turf war. And the Corkians are going to go at it with the United Irishmen, and it's going to be a gang war like what you're going to see in Chicago with Capone's beer wars when we get to that period. But nonetheless, there's violence, very, very bloody violence that's breaking out on the streets of New Orleans. These Irish labor bosses, however, are going to figure out that there's two sides to this labor supply coin. Of course, there's the businessman side. I mean, supplying the goods, that's obvious. You can make a dollar there. But you can also make a dollar on the workers themselves. Keep in mind, I would say most of these Irish immigrants came over out of economic necessity. And so if they're desperate to find a job, it's going to be relatively easy to get them to kick back a little bit of that paycheck to you as more or less a finder's fee for getting them that job. And so this is going to be a practice that will continue on, and although other groups will pick up on it, you will have Irish labor bosses, including people that are supposed to be, representing workers through unions, people like Joe Ryan in New York, that are going to continue this practice well into the 1930s. So it's a practice that's going to be 100 years old. In any case, you're going to begin to see the evolution of Irish gangs. By the 1850s, the Irish had been in the city for quite a while, and illegal activity, or activity that really pushed that envelope of illegality, is going to become more and more commercial. I want to introduce you to the red light district of New Orleans, and that would be Gallatin Street. Gallatin Street was home to virtually any vice that you could possibly imagine. There were dozens of gambling dens that dotted the landscape, and there were all kinds of saloons, watering holes, which on its face was not illegal, but many times the stuff that was happening on the inside was. There were dance halls where prostitution was rampant, and speaking of prostitution, there were bordellos that were functioning, operating pretty much out there in broad daylight. So much of what we've talked about so far has been male Irish immigrants, Irish workers, men coming over. We've talked about canal diggers and we've talked about industrial workers, but of course there's another side to this. There are Irish women that are coming over. I mean, the Great Hunger, the Irish potato famine, is not just something that's only affecting men. Of course it's affecting women as well, and there will be hundreds of thousands of Irish women that follow their men over to a new opportunity in America. And they're going to take typical jobs that you would imagine Irish working class women to take. They're going to become seamstresses. They're going to become maids and nannies. They're going to become cooks and waitresses. And they're largely going to fill this desperate need of blue-collar workers in this emerging economy. There's another aspect to this as well, a very gray area, and in certain instances, outright illegal aspect to this, and of course I'm talking about prostitution. Numerous Irish women are going to become prostitutes in New Orleans, and on the one hand, this can be a horrible trap. It can be a life of misery and ultimately could lead to a violent death. There's also another side to this as well. It could mean upward mobility. The historian Virginia Wolcott made a really compelling case for how respectability needs to be really rethought, or maybe rethought in certain instances, especially with respect to prostitution. Now, Wolcott's taking a look at 1920s Detroit, but a very similar case could be laid out for these Irish female workers that are coming over and choosing to go into the prostitution industry. A few of them, former prostitutes that is, are going to become prominent madams in the quote-unquote lace and curtain world of New Orleans. I'm talking about people like Fanny Sweet or Kate Townsend, and these former prostitutes are essentially going to market these Irish girls, young women and girls, to some of the upper echelon of New Orleans high society. It's not that much different than what you see going on with these Irish labor bosses that we were talking about just a second ago. But success in this quote-unquote industry is going to require alliances. It's going to require friends in high places, and maybe most importantly of all, it's going to require favors. Favors from politicians and civic leaders. Obviously, prostitution is illegal, and you need politicians that are not going to really be willing to crack down on you if you're going to operate and make a go at this. You're going to need to have it be acceptable in certain social circles. While you may not mind it existing with a good deal of discretion, you don't want your city, you don't want your region really to be defined by this. So you need to push certain buttons, pull certain levers in the social powers that be. But if you really want to make an effective go at industries like prostitution, then you're very, very much going to need the assistance of the police. Now, we talked about this with respect to Frederica Mandelbaum, and I told you that a very important part, a tenet of organized crime, something that sets it apart from other forms of criminal activity, is getting people in power to acquiesce to your will, to look the other way, or to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And certainly the New Orleans police force really fit that bill with respect to a key ingredient in illegal activities in New Orleans in the Gilded Age. As the economy in New Orleans modernized, the need for reform became more and more apparent. The old way of doing business in the city just was not going to cut it any longer. You had people that were beginning to crowd into these tight little areas, and it was not going to be as simple as business as usual. So there's a very obvious need for reform that becomes really, really apparent in the Gilded Age. And this need for reform is going to trickle all the way down to a need to really rethink the way that laws are enforced within the city. And of course, what I'm talking about here is you're going to see the professionalization of law enforcement. New Orleans is going to embark on this process by establishing the Metropolitan Police Force. So similar to New York, what you're going to begin to see is the professionalization of law enforcement within the city. But let's make some things clear with respect to what police work was actually like. Bottom line was, it was difficult work. And one of the things that made it difficult, among others, was that it was dangerous work. It didn't pay especially well. Yes, it was a respected profession, and no, not anybody could do it, but it didn't exactly show up in the paycheck area, if you understand what I'm saying. Maybe most importantly of all, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Louisianans were not going to do this. They were not going to do this dangerous, low-paying work. And so what's going to happen is you're going to see Irish Louisianans begin to gravitate toward police work. The question becomes why? Well, on the one hand, this is a step up in the world. We're going to go from canal diggers to a more middle class, more professional sort of occupation in police work. Moreover, I think it's pretty natural that the Irish are going to gravitate into these positions primarily because they had been there for a generation. No, the native-born population wasn't really willing to do this, but the Irish had adapted. Culturally, they had been acculturated. They understood the local culture. They understood why things were the way that they were. And maybe most importantly of all, they spoke the language. They spoke English. So while this was not, a really huge game changer with respect to the Irish experience in the United States, it wasn't digging ditches, that pun probably is intended considering it literally was the Irish that dug those canal ditches a generation earlier, okay? So, continuing on in this conversation, police work was a respectable profession, but I also think you could make a case that it is going to become the political plum of the Irish. Now, let me explain what I mean when I say political plum. We've talked about political machines, and I told you at the time that what this was a relationship whereby I, the politician, will trade you a political favor. I will do something for you within my power if you vote for me. And not only do I want your vote, but I want every vote that's within your little orbit. And the more, the merrier. So if I am appointed, if I am elected to one of these municipal positions, I at the very least have some leverage and some influence, and I probably can get you a job. Police work was one of those job categories where if you knew somebody within City Hall, it made life infinitely easier as far as getting on the force. And so in a lot of ways, you're going to see Irish people in New Orleans begin to gravitate toward police work, and part of the reason for this was the way that the political machines worked. Now, I think that we can all agree that although it was a step up in the world, police work was relatively modest when it comes to your paycheck. But I think it was also an understood, maybe not written down, but certainly understood idea that police work had, I guess, what we might call a little bit of enterprising, a little bit of entrepreneurial spirit embedded in it as well. We've talked about the red light district in New Orleans and the fact that these illicit activities existed, and in some instances they existed out in the open. And these activities would not have been possible without a cooperative police force. And so if you're on the other side of that $100 handshake that we were talking about with Marm Mandelbaum, you're the policeman that happens to be on the receiving end of that conversation. Boy, would it be nice if you just sort of weren't in this area this time tomorrow. Well, you're not exactly breaking the law. You're not exactly taking a bribe. You're just sort of, doing what is asked of you. And so this is what I'm talking about with respect to a cooperative police force. And it's also what I'm talking about as far as local policemen that were on the take. Now, before we move on and we talk about the life and times of David Hennessey, there's one more element to police work that I really want to underscore. It's going to sound like I'm coming out of left field with this, but I do want to talk to you about a new group of immigrants that are going to begin showing up in New Orleans in the 1890s, and that would be the Italians. And in particular, I'm talking about Sicilians. Again, if you know anything about American history, you'll know that it's Southern Italians that begin to emigrate to really all over the world, but certainly to the United States. And one of the reasons why is a changing economy back in Italy. But beginning in the 1890s, Sicilians are going to show up in New Orleans, and in a lot of ways, they're going to replace older immigrant groups like the Irish. So at the same time that you see the Irish beginning to abandon those working class, unskilled, very difficult, laborious jobs for police work and other municipal sorts of jobs, you're beginning to see new immigrants, including the Italians, that are beginning to replace them on the economic ladder. And if you pay attention, not only to this podcast, but in American history, instruction, generally speaking, you can see that that kind of model applies not only to occupational realms of immigrant life, but also neighborhoods. What neighborhoods these newcomers are beginning to occupy, okay? So let's talk a little bit about how the Sicilians were perceived when they started showing up in New Orleans. Do you remember me talking about how the Irish were seen as an inferior race, how the English kind of described them as a race of people that were clannish and very susceptible to underground secret societies, incapable of being governed, incapable of wrapping their minds around the concepts of democracy? The Italians were slurred with all of these ethnic and to some extent racial disrespects at the same time. And so a lot of these anti-immigrant stereotypes are really going to revolve around the criminal nature, or what is perceived to be the criminal nature, of these Sicilian newcomers by the native-born New Orleans population. Quick example, the newspaper, the Times-Picayune, described many of these Sicilian newcomers as, quote, Dago criminals. And so if this is the kind of reporting that you're getting on a day-by-day basis, that immigration equals criminals, what the next equal sign is going to be is we need more police. We need more policemen. We need more policemen out there on the streets patrolling the streets. And so, as you're going to find out here, there's more than one connection when it comes to police work and processes of immigration and, of course, organized crime. David Hennessey was born to be a police officer. He was born in 1858 to Irish immigrant parents. And his father is going to be a policeman in his own right. And idolizing his dad as he did, police work is just going to become sort of his birthright. And upon joining the force, he's going to rise really quickly through the ranks of the New Orleans Police Department. First as a capable policeman, widely liked throughout the city, widely respected, but his reputation is really going to hit the stratosphere after 1881, because it's going to be in that year that he's going to catch an Italian criminal, a guy by the name of Giuseppe Esposito. Now, on the one hand, this is really going to enshrine him as a guy who's tough on crime. This is a guy that we can get behind and a guy that we can trust. At the same time, as I was saying just a few minutes ago, the Italians had become, in certain realms of New Orleans life, public enemy number one. And so this guy is really seen as an up-and-comer in the ranks of law enforcement officials in the 1880s in New Orleans. So let's fast forward a little bit. 1888, a guy by the name of Joseph Shakespeare is going to be elected as the mayor of New Orleans. And one of the first things that he does is he appoints David Hennessey as chief of police. Great honor, but he's going to inherit a situation that is, shall we say, complicated. Okay, more on that in just a second. For the time being, I want to take you back and refresh your memory here. It wasn't that long ago that we were talking about these Irish gangs that formed upon their entry into New Orleans. And it had everything to do with supplying labor to these local businessmen, and there was a competition for resources. I also talked in this episode about how the Italians began to replace the Irish in terms of some of the heavy lifting, grunt work, blue-collar jobs that the city's industries required. You could make a very similar case in the criminal underworld as well. The criminal underworld of New Orleans was beginning to transition away from the Irish and into the hands of these transplanted new-coming Italian immigrants. In particular, you're seeing two rival sects of gangsters beginning to emerge. You've got the Matronga family, and their great rival would be the Provenzano family. And very similar to the Irish of the 1830s, what both of these factions want to do is deliver Italian laborers to the river docks. Keep in mind, New Orleans was a center of trade, which meant that shipments of goods came in every day. They had to be loaded and unloaded off of these ships. And so it wasn't really that much different than the Irish labor bosses a generation earlier that would supply cheap workers to local businessmen. It was another competition for turf, and obviously it's going to lead to conflict. And the boiling point is going to come in May 1890 when you're seeing a shootout on the river. And you're in this shootout, you're going to see three Matrongas that are going to be injured. And a leader of the gang, Anthony Matronga, is going to lose a leg. And obviously, this is going to be one of those blood feuds that's going to rage on for years and years after the actual event took place. Now, what is also going to happen is the leader of the Provenzanos, a guy named Joseph Provenzano, is going to reach out to David Hennessey. And I'm quoting him here, Chief Hennessey, "A little misunderstanding. That's all this was. I'm sure you will agree that you have much to gain by hearing our side of the story. Yes?" End quote. Well, as certain sources have it, David Hennessey did hear the Provenzanos out. He talked to them, and apparently he liked what he heard, because weeks after this alleged sit-down was to take place, he was frequently seen in the company of the Provenzano brothers. Allegedly, he went into business with them, gaining a stake in the Red Lantern, a saloon located in the French Quarter. Now, to be really clear here, David Hennessey was not uncommon. We've gone through the entrepreneurial element of policing in New Orleans. And New Orleans police officers were some of the lowest paid police officials anywhere in the country, and it was almost expected that you were going to take quote-unquote work on the side, okay? The other element of this is that David Hennessey himself was a complex individual, and it was rumored that he was soon to be testifying on behalf of the Provenzanos. Now, if you're a Matronga, you simply cannot allow this to happen, because this is not just anybody that's pointing the finger at you. This is the chief of police within the city. So if you're a Matronga, you've got to find a way to respond. In October 1890, the response came in the assassination of David Hennessey. He was on his nightly patrol, walking back to his home, and he's going to be assassinated by someone within the Matronga network. Now, the fallout is going to be infinitely worse than the crime. Mayor Shakespeare is going to react, because you have to understand, there is widespread public outcry to bring those responsible to justice. And there's a lot of people that are jumping to conclusions. There's a lot of smoke surrounding the Matrongas, but the investigation has only begun to get started, so let's let the wheels of justice do their thing, and, sometimes this doesn't move as quickly as we'd like to get it to move. The slow pace did not do Shakespeare a whole lot of favors, and so ultimately what he's going to resort to is a dragnet, widespread arrests. As a matter of fact, he's going to arrest all Italian males from ages 12 to 25. And within 3 hours, he's going to have 60 arrests, 60 Italian Americans that are going to be in police custody. Now, make no mistake about it, this is an unmistakable anti-immigrant sentiment that is pumping out of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment. that Hennessey had made inroads into. And so what you're going to see is these individuals that are going to be vetted. Basically, they're going to be interrogated. And February 16th, 1891, 9 of these individuals are going to go on trial. And the proceedings are going to last 3 months. Again, the wheels of justice are moving very, very slowly. There was great pain with respect to the killing of David Hennessey, and a lot of people were really getting anxious with respect to whether or not anybody would be brought to justice for their crimes. February 16th, 1891, the trial begins. 3 months later, all 9 defendants are acquitted. No one is held responsible for the murder of David Hennessey. And so the rumor is that the jury had been bought off by Matronka Min. Now, what you're beginning to see is a lynch mob assembling. And that mob is going to storm the jail in which these 9 Italians are held. The mob eventually overruns the guards. They're going to break into the prison. They're going to drag these Italians out into the streets. 7 of them are going to be shot to death, and another 2 are going to be hanged. In some, there's going to be 11 Italians that are going to be lynched in the aftermath of the trial. And as this violence is playing out on the streets of a major American city, you've got the mob in the background chanting, "Who killed a chief? Who killed a chief?" A very obvious ethnic anti-Italian slur that was being chanted at the same time that people are literally being killed. The lynching of the 11 Italian men in the aftermath of the Hennessey case is going to make headlines all across the U.S., but not exactly in the way that you might think. The New York Times is going to run a story, and it's going to proclaim, quote, "life and property safer," end quote, in southern metropolis. In other words, although these 11 men essentially died at the hands of the lynch mob, life in New Orleans was a little safer because of this. It just goes to show you how strong that vitriolic anti-immigrant sentiment is becoming by the 1890s. Mayor Shakespeare also had a chance to chime in on the event, and he proclaimed, quote, "I do consider that the act was, however deplorable, a necessity and justifiable," end quote. In other words, I don't exactly agree with the way they went about doing it, but they did what they had to do to make our town a little safer. This experience, this event, is going to live on in the Italian-American community, and it's going to go beyond the city boundaries of New Orleans. It's going to drive the Sicilian community in that city underground, where it's going to vow to preserve its way of life, even if that means shielding it from the law enforcement community. But the Hennessey case is going to be really, really important as a watershed moment in the history of organized crime, because what it's going to demonstrate is that in order to function, in order to exist, you're going to have inter-ethnic, inter-group cooperation. The idea that the mafia was something that was solely an Italian organization that was run for Italian criminals is going to be one of the greater myths that you're going to find in the history of organized crime. It was always inter-ethnic. In its heyday, it was inter-ethnic, and even after its heyday had passed, it was an inter-ethnic, to some extent, interracial organization. It was not really run by solely one group. It's going to depend on how you want to look at it, but in a way, the Hennessey case is going to demonstrate that the Irish had kind of graduated into this new role in municipal politics. They had served their time with these blue-collar jobs, and they had kind of taken a step forward in graduating into police work. but they're going to assume this new role, or some of them may assume this new role in underworld dealings, underworld relations. Now, to the Sicilians, the message was clear that the New Orleans Police Department was this bastion of Irish police officers who had to be dealt with one way or another, sometimes bribes, other times alliances, and in some extreme cases, murder, violence. But to the Italian gangsters, what the Irish cops were part and parcel of the underground. You can think of them kind of as mobsters in uniforms, or at least that's the way that these Sicilian gangsters looked upon them. There's another element that I need you to be aware of, and that is that the Hennessey case is going to represent a microcosm of what will come in the world of organized crime. You're going to see not just this inter-ethnic alliance begin to forge, you'll see numerous inter-ethnic alliances come to fruition. It's not going to be just the law enforcement community that is going to be infiltrated by the tentacles of organized crime. You're going to see other institutions, political institutions, public figures, other elms of what might loosely be described as public life. And in the process, you're going to see the emergence of a secret underground world that was determined to shield itself from any sort of outside infiltration. Time to give some credit where credit is due. If you want to know more about the life and times of David Hennessey, I highly recommend a book by T.J. English entitled Paddywhacked. Now, the topic of this book is Irish organized crime in the history of the United States. And as you're going to find out if you go ahead and take a look at that, is that the Hennessey case is one moment, albeit a watershed moment, in the history of organized crime within the Irish community throughout American history. So I highly recommend that book. I also highly recommend Thomas Repetto's American Mafia. He's going to point to the Hennessey case as well, but he's also going to provide a really good analysis of how and why inter-ethnic group cooperation was so central, so necessary to make organized crime effective and successful in the big picture. So I want to recommend Repetto's book as well. Now, I'm hopeful that you'll follow me over to episode 3, which is going to examine a context that I bet many of you could have guessed on, could have said, well, I can see how that would fit into this narrative of the podcast. And of course, that's Chicago. And so I'm hopeful that you'll follow me over to the next podcast episode entitled Beginnings on the Banks of Mud City, USA, where we will talk about the centrality of political machines and their connection to organized crime.